My name is Helena, 36 years old, and I'm sitting in my lawyer's office watching Marcus sign divorce papers with the same hand that once wore his wedding ring. He has no idea I've known everything for 6 months. Every lie, every betrayal, every euro he spent on her in Barcelona. 2 weeks ago, he returned home pretending his business trip went perfectly normal, kissing me hello like he hadn't abandoned us. Our 8-year-old son, Ethan, still doesn't know the truth about where Daddy really was, but Marcus is about to discover that my silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Before I share how I turned his own game against him, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit like and subscribe to hear how a wife's patience became the perfect trap that a cheating husband never saw coming. 1 year ago, anyone looking at our family would have seen the American dream perfectly packaged in our 4-bedroom Queen Anne home in Seattle. The kind of life that looked flawless from the outside, with Marcus pulling his BMW into our tree-lined driveway each evening while I helped Ethan with homework at our granite kitchen island. We were that couple others envied at school events, him with his tech executive confidence, and me with my successful restaurant management career, both of us cheering at Ethan's soccer games like we had it all figured out. Marcus worked as a marketing director at one of Seattle's biggest tech companies, the kind with ping-pong tables and kombucha on tap that he used to mock before joining them. His salary was impressive, $150,000 plus bonuses, and he never let anyone forget it. He had this way of casually mentioning his title in conversations, sliding it in between discussions about weather and weekend plans. I managed a chain of boutique restaurants downtown, a job I'd worked toward for 12 years, building my reputation one perfectly executed service at a time. Our house sat in one of those neighborhoods where kids still rode bikes, until streetlights came on and neighbours actually knew each other's names. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a kitchen. I'd renovated myself over 2 summers, and a backyard where Ethan practiced penalty kicks against the fence until the paint chipped. We had the right cars, the right zip code, the right school district. Everything was precisely where it should be, at least on paper. But marriages don't fall apart overnight. They erode slowly, so gradually that you don't notice the foundation cracking until you're standing in rubble. The first signs started about 8 months ago, small changes that seemed insignificant individually but created a pattern when I finally stepped back to look. Marcus started working late, which wasn't unusual in tech, except now it was every night instead of just during product launches. He'd text at 6 saying he'd missed dinner, then at 8 saying don't wait up. His phone, which used to lie forgotten on counters and coffee tables, became an extension of his hand screen, always face down, notifications silenced. When it buzzed, he'd glance at it with this little smile that had nothing to do with work emails. Then came the gym membership, which would have been less suspicious if Marcus hadn't spent our entire marriage mocking fitness culture. Suddenly, he was there 5 mornings a week at 5:30, coming home freshly showered, smelling like the gym's expensive shampoo instead of our regular drugstore brand. New clothes appeared in his closet, slim-fit shirts and designer jeans that cost more than our monthly grocery budget. He bought cologne, the expensive kind, from Nordstrom, not the Old Spice he'd used since college. Weekend emergency meetings became frequent, always urgent, always unavoidable. He'd apologize profusely, promise to make it up to us, then disappear for 6 hours on Saturdays. His laptop would stay home, which struck me as odd for someone supposedly dealing with work crises. When he returned, he'd be distracted, checking his phone every few minutes, like he was waiting for something. The credit card statements started showing charges that didn't make sense. Lunch at restaurants 40 minutes from his office when he had client meetings downtown. $200 charges at Nordstrom during his supposed gym time. Hotel bar tabs at the Fairmont on Tuesday afternoons. When I asked about them, casually trying not to sound suspicious, he always had explanations that were just plausible enough to avoid confrontation, but never quite satisfied, the itch of doubt growing stronger each day. My friend Maria worked in accounting at Marcus's company, and we'd sometimes grab coffee when I was downtown. She started mentioning things that didn't align with Marcus's stories. The big client dinner he'd attended, Maria said it was cancelled last minute. The weekend leadership retreat. She hadn't heard about any retreat, and accounting would definitely know if the company was paying for one. One night, I found myself doing something I'd sworn I'd never do in my marriage. Marcus was in the shower, his phone charging on the nightstand, and I picked it up. The screen was locked, but notifications were visible. A text from someone named S said, "Can't wait for tomorrow," with a heart emoji. When he came out of the bathroom, I was pretending to read my book, but my heart was racing like I'd run a marathon. That's when I made a decision that would define the next 6 months of my life. Instead of confronting him with my suspicions and half-formed evidence, I would wait. I would watch. I would gather every piece of proof I needed, because if my marriage was ending, I would be the one controlling how it ended, not Marcus with his gym muscles and mysterious smiles. I opened my own bank account the next day at a different bank across town, starting with small deposits that wouldn't be noticed, 50, here 100 there, cash back from grocery runs that I'd squirrel away like a Depression-era grandmother. I made an appointment with Jennifer Stone, a divorce attorney recommended by a friend who'd been through her own marital disaster. Jennifer's office was discreet in a building full of therapists and accountants, the kind of place where no one asked why you were there. The meeting with Jennifer was educational in ways I hadn't expected. She explained Washington state divorce laws, custody considerations, asset division. She told me about admissible evidence, about documentation, about the importance of maintaining status quo while building a case. She said something that stuck with me through everything that followed. The person who prepares best usually wins, not the person who's right. I installed a tracking app on Marcus's phone under the pretense of family safety, one of those programs parents use to track their kids. But that works just as well for wayward husbands. I started screenshotting credit card statements, saving emails, documenting every inconsistency. I became a detective in my own life, investigating the man I'd shared a bed with for 10 years. 3 weeks into my investigation, she materialized from the digital ether like a perfectly filtered Instagram ghost. Sofia Herrera, 28 years old, originally from Barcelona, newly hired as a senior designer in Marcus's company's creative department. Her LinkedIn profile showed she'd started 2 months ago, right when Marcus discovered his passion for morning workouts. The timeline was so obvious it would have been funny if it wasn't destroying my family. Her Instagram was a carefully curated museum of aspirational living. Beach clubs in Sitges, wine tastings in Priorat Sunset, photos from Park Güell with captions about living her best life. Every photo showed her in designer clothes I recognized from my secret hobby of browsing Net-a-Porter without ever buying anything. She had that effortless European elegance that made American women feel like we were trying too hard just by existing. Long dark hair that probably air-dried perfectly skin, that glowed without foundation, the kind of casual sophistication that Marcus had apparently found irresistible. I spent hours studying her posts, like they were evidence in a murder trial, which, in a way, they were evidence of the murder of my marriage. 3 weeks after she started at his company, Marcus appeared in the background of a group photo at a work happy hour. 2 weeks later, he was tagged in her story at a concert I didn't know he'd attended. The progression was mapped out in digital breadcrumbs, each post another step toward the inevitable. My friend Maria became my unwitting spy, sharing office gossip over our coffee dates without knowing she was providing intelligence. Sofia was talented, Maria admitted, but also obviously fishing in the executive pool. She wore dresses that were just professional enough to avoid HR complaints, but definitely designed to be noticed. She laughed too loud at the married men's jokes, found reasons to stop by their offices, Always needed mentorship from someone with a wedding ring. The credit card statements became more damning once I knew what to look for. That lunch, 40 minutes from his office, the same neighborhood as Sofia's apartment, the Nordstrom charges, women's jewelry and perfume items that never made their way to me, $1,000 at a Spanish restaurant downtown on a night he'd said he was at a boring client dinner. The reservation, which I called to verify, had been for two. The Fairmont Hotel charges were the most insulting. Tuesday afternoons, like he couldn't even be creative about his affair schedule. Always the same amount, a bottle of champagne and room service, charged to our joint credit card like he wanted to be caught, or simply didn't care enough to hide it. I wondered if he took her to the same room each time, if they had their special spot, where they laughed about the stupid wife at home who didn't suspect anything. I took screenshots of everything, building a digital file that grew larger each week. Sofia's post, wearing a necklace that matched a Tiffany charge on our card. Marcus in the background of her friend's story at a restaurant where he was supposedly entertaining clients from Tokyo. The afternoon he said he was golfing, but the tracking app showed him at her apartment building for 3 hours. The most damaging evidence came from Marcus himself, his arrogance ultimately being his downfall. He'd forgotten that our iPads were synced and his messages with Sofia appeared on the device Ethan used for games. The conversations ranged from explicit to mundane, creating a complete picture of their relationship. He called her mi amor, practiced his broken Spanish in texts that would have been endearing if they weren't evidence of betrayal. They discussed restaurants, weekend plans, how to handle the situation with me. In one particularly enlightening exchange, Sofia asked when he was going to leave me. His response was a masterclass in manipulation. He claimed I was unstable, that he worried about what I'd do if he left, that Ethan needed stability until he was older. He painted me as a burden he was nobly bearing a cross he'd eventually lay down when the time was right. Sofia responded with understanding and patience, playing the role of the long-suffering other woman perfectly. The kicker came when I discovered the Barcelona plan. It started with Marcus mentioning a potential international project, laying groundwork for what was coming. He'd casually bring up how the company was expanding into European markets, how someone would need to oversee the transition, how it would be a great career opportunity, even if it meant time away from family. I nodded along, playing the supportive wife while screenshotting the emails on his iPad, showing he'd already volunteered for the position. He'd been corresponding with the Barcelona office for weeks, not about business development, but about relocating there with a partner to help with cultural integration. The partner, of course, was Sofia, who'd convinced him that her local knowledge would be invaluable. The emails discussed apartment hunting visa requirements for extended stays and salary negotiations that included a substantial cost of living adjustment he hadn't mentioned to me. What hurt most wasn't the affair itself, but the meticulous planning to abandon us. He'd opened a Spanish bank account, started transferring money in small amounts that added up to $70,000 from our joint savings. He'd researched international schools in Barcelona, not for Ethan, but for the hypothetical children he and Sofia discussed having, in texts that made me physically nauseous to read. I printed everything, organizing it in a binder that I kept in a locked drawer at my office. Bank statements highlighted with suspicious charges, screenshots of their conversations, photos pulled from social media showing them together when he was supposedly elsewhere, a timeline I'd created showing the progression of their relationship against the deterioration of our marriage. It was a prosecutor's dream, which is exactly what Jennifer Stone said when I showed her during our second meeting. Jennifer was impressed by my thoroughness, but warned me about the emotional toll of maintaining the charade. "Every day you pretend not to know is another day of trauma," she said. But I wasn't traumatized. I was angry, and anger was fuel that kept me focused on the end game. Every false kiss from Marcus, every family dinner where he smiled at Ethan while texting her under the table every night, He reached for me in bed, smelling of another woman's perfume, just added another log to the fire that would eventually burn everything down. The universe seemed to be on my side, providing evidence when I needed it most. Marcus's company had a security breach that required all employees to update their passwords. He did it while I was in the room, not bothering to hide it because he'd grown complacent in his deception. I memorized the pattern his fingers made on the keyboard, later figuring out the password that gave me access to his email account, where the real evidence lived. The emails between Marcus and Sofia were a revelation in delusion. They'd constructed an entire fantasy life that required my erasure. Sofia sent him listings for Barcelona apartments with terraces overlooking the Mediterranean. He responded with furniture suggestions from European brands I'd never heard of. They discussed which neighborhoods were best for their lifestyle, using the word "our," like they'd already merged into one entity that didn't include the family he'd built in Seattle. In one email thread, they planned their goodbye tour of Seattle restaurants they wanted to visit one last time before leaving for their new life. The list included places that had been special to Marcus and me: our anniversary spot, where Ethan was conceived, where we'd celebrated promotions and mourned losses. He was planning to overwrite our memories with her turning our history into their foreplay. The announcement came on a Thursday evening in March, staged with the same theatrical precision Marcus brought to his work presentations. He'd asked me to put Ethan to bed early, saying we needed to discuss something important. I knew what was coming because I'd seen the flight confirmations in his email: 2 tickets to Barcelona, leaving in 5 days, only one returning 3 weeks later. The other was one way. He'd prepared a speech complete with printed materials about the Barcelona project, like he was pitching a campaign to clients, instead of abandoning his family. The opportunity was too good to pass up, he explained, showing me graphs about European market expansion that meant nothing because I already knew the real reason had dark hair and a Barcelona accent. 6 months overseas to establish the new office. Maybe longer, depending on how things developed. He'd fly back monthly to visit, he promised, and we could video chat every day. The performance was Oscar-worthy, his face a mask of professional excitement mixed with family man reluctance. This was hard for him, he said, but sometimes we had to make sacrifices for our future. The money would be incredible, setting us up for early retirement. Ethan could visit during summer break, see Europe expand his horizons. He sold it like he believed it, like I hadn't seen the apartment lease he'd signed, with only his name on it. I played my role perfectly, the surprised but supportive wife who understood career demands. I asked the right questions about logistics, schooling for Ethan, maintaining the house alone. I even shed a few tears that weren't entirely fake, because despite everything, watching him lie so elaborately to my face hurt in ways I hadn't expected. He comforted me, promised it would fly by, said he'd miss us every second. All while Sofia was probably packing her bags 10 miles away. The morning he left was a production of false emotion and empty promises. He woke Ethan early for a special breakfast, making pancakes in shapes like he was Father of the Year instead of father of the century's biggest betrayal. He gave our son a compass, told him that no matter how far apart they were, it would always point toward home. Ethan clutched it like a talisman, not understanding that Daddy's true north had shifted to another continent and another woman. At the airport, he hugged us both for the cameras I'm sure he imagined were rolling on his life's movie. He kissed me, a perfunctory gesture that tasted like betrayal and breath mints. He ruffled Ethan's hair, promised to bring back FC Barcelona jerseys and Spanish candy. Then he walked through security without looking back, probably because Sofia was waiting at gate N16 and he didn't want to be late for their romantic international flight. I knew she was there because I'd followed her Instagram stories that morning. A post from the airport lounge with champagne glasses captioned, "Adventure begins," with a plane emoji. The comments from her friends were telling congratulations and heart emojis, everyone apparently in on the secret, except the stupid wife standing at departures with a confused 8-year-old. The drive home was silent except for Ethan's questions that I couldn't honestly answer. Why did Daddy have to go so far? Why couldn't we go with him? When would he really be back? I gave him the lies Marcus had provided about work and opportunity and temporary separation, while mentally calculating how long I could maintain this fiction before the truth became unavoidable. 24 hours later, Sofia's Instagram exploded with Barcelona content. Beachside selfies, architecture photos, food posts from restaurants I recognized from the emails they'd exchanged. She was careful not to show Marcus directly, but his reflection appeared in sunglasses, his hand on the edge of dinner tables, his shadow in her sunset photos. They were living their dream life while I explained to Ethan's teacher why Daddy wouldn't be at the spring concert. The first video call came 3 days after he left Marcus, propped against what he claimed was his temporary corporate apartment, but what I recognized as the exposed brick from the listing they'd chosen together. He looked relaxed, tanned, already wearing a linen shirt I'd never seen before. He asked about Ethan's soccer practice, my work, mundane things that felt surreal, given I knew Sofia was probably just outside the frame. Ethan showed him a drawing he'd made, and Marcus promised to hang it in his office, an office I knew he'd never see because he was too busy playing house with his mistress. The money transfers started immediately insulting in their meagerness. $500 a month for a child whose private school tuition was $3,000. He claimed the cost of living adjustment hadn't kicked in yet, that the Barcelona setup was expensive, that he'd send more soon. Meanwhile, the credit card statements showed charges at Michelin-starred restaurants and designer boutiques, a weekend trip to Mallorca that cost more than 3 months of Ethan's expenses. I became a single mother overnight, handling everything Marcus had selectively participated in before. Morning routines, homework battles, soccer practice, doctor appointments, parent-teacher conferences, weekend activities, bedtime stories that now included questions about when Daddy was coming home. I'd fall into bed exhausted at 10, only to lie awake checking the private investigators' reports from Barcelona. I'd hired the PI through Jennifer's recommendation, a former cop who specialized in international cases. His reports were thorough and devastating. Photos of Marcus and Sofia at beach clubs, their bodies intertwined on daybeds that cost more to rent for a day than he sent for Ethan's support. Videos of them shopping in the Gothic Quarter. Marcus buying her jewelry while his son wore shoes with holes in them. Documentation of their weekend trips to Paris, Rome, Lisbon, the grand tour he'd always promised me but never delivered. The worst part was maintaining the facade for Ethan. I couldn't tell him the truth without evidence that Marcus had definitively abandoned us, not just temporarily relocated. So I smiled when he talked about Daddy's important work, helped him mark days on the calendar, until the next video call displayed the postcards Marcus sent with generic messages about missing us. Each lie I told to protect my son felt like swallowing glass, necessary but damaging. Marcus called weekly, always at times that suggested he was squeezing us in between activities with Sofia. The backgrounds changed, different rooms in their apartment cafes, once even a hotel in Ibiza, where he claimed to be for a conference, but where Sofia had posted bikini photos that same day. He'd ask about bills and household maintenance like a concerned husband, while living a bachelor's dream on another continent. 4 months in, the calls became less frequent. He missed Ethan's birthday video call, claiming a work emergency, but posting on LinkedIn about a sunset sailing experience that same evening. The money transfers became irregular, sometimes late, always insufficient. His emails turned brief, businesslike, discussing logistics rather than family. He was dissolving our existence from his life like we were a subscription service he was gradually cancelling. I used this time productively, following Jennifer's advice, to establish myself as the primary parent. I documented every missed call, every late payment, every broken promise. I took Ethan to therapy to discuss his father's absence, creating a paper trail of abandonment. I refinanced the house in my name, only using Marcus's absence as justification. I moved money from our joint accounts into my separate one, keeping meticulous records that showed it went to household expenses Marcus wasn't covering. The private investigator delivered the killing blow in month 5. Marcus and Sofia weren't just living together, they were engaged. She'd been wearing a ring for weeks, a 2-carat diamond that explained the mysterious $20,000 withdrawal from Marcus's 401k. They'd been spotted at the American embassy, likely discussing marriage visas. The investigator had photos of them with a real estate agent, looking at larger apartments suitable for a family, the family Marcus apparently planned to have with her. The collapse of his Spanish fantasy came swiftly and without warning, at least from Marcus's perspective. I'd been tracking the deterioration through my investigators' reports for weeks, watching their fairy tale crack like drought-stricken earth. Sofia had grown bored of Marcus once the initial excitement wore off, and reality set in that he was just another middle-aged American with delusions of grandeur and a dwindling bank account. The first signs appeared on her Instagram, the couple's photos gradually replaced by solo shots and girls' nights. She started posting from events Marcus couldn't afford anymore. Yacht parties and gallery openings where she appeared on the arm of men who looked like they actually owned yachts rather than just renting them for Instagram photos. Her stories showed late nights at clubs where Marcus was notably absent, probably home checking his rapidly depleting savings account. My investigator reported that Sofia had reconnected with an ex-boyfriend, a wealthy Catalan real estate developer who'd been waiting in the wings. They were spotted at restaurants Marcus could never afford, driving cars that cost more than Marcus made in a year. The engagement ring disappeared from her finger, replaced by designer jewelry that suggested she'd found a more lucrative arrangement. The final blow came when Marcus's company declined to extend his Barcelona assignment. The European expansion hadn't materialized the expected returns, and they needed him back in Seattle immediately, or not at all. He'd burned bridges with his extended absence, missing important meetings via video call because he was too busy living his Mediterranean fantasy. His reputation had shifted from rising star to cautionary tale about men who thought with the wrong head. I knew about his imminent return 3 days before he called to announce it. The investigator had photographed him at the airport alone, with the luggage that suggested permanent relocation rather than temporary visit. Sofia hadn't even seen him off, too busy posting from a weekend trip to Saint-Tropez with her new benefactor. Marcus looked haggard in the photos. The Spanish sun had turned his skin leathery rather than golden, and his expression showed a man whose delusions had finally met reality. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was helping Ethan with his science project about ecosystems ironically appropriate, given the toxic environment his father had created. Marcus's voice was bright with false enthusiasm as he announced the project had wrapped up earlier than expected, and he'd be home by Friday. He spun it as success, claiming he'd accomplished everything needed in record time, but I heard the desperation underneath the panic of a man whose escape plan had evaporated. I played the delighted wife, perfectly expressing joy at his early return, while knowing exactly why he was really coming back. His credit cards were maxed out, his savings depleted, and his Spanish fantasy had left him for someone with a bigger yacht. He needed the stability I provided the house he hadn't paid for in 6 months, the respectability of family life to rebuild his shattered professional reputation. Preparing for his return required Oscar-worthy performance skills. I cleaned the house thoroughly, not for him, but to document my maintenance of our home during his abandonment. I stocked his favourite foods, hung a welcome home banner with Ethan, prepared his side of the closet, like a devoted wife awaiting her husband's triumphant return, all while finalising divorce papers with Jennifer and setting up the hidden cameras that would capture his lies in high definition. Ethan was beside himself with excitement, counting down hours like Christmas Eve. He'd made a book of drawings showing everything Daddy had missed: soccer goals, school plays, lost teeth, growth spurts marked on the kitchen doorframe. The innocence of his enthusiasm made my stomach turn, knowing his father had chosen Barcelona beaches over bedtime stories, Spanish wine over science fairs. I coordinated with Jennifer to serve papers at the perfect moment after gathering final evidence of his deception, but before he could re-establish residency claims. We had bank records showing he'd spent over $120,000 on Sofia, draining our savings and retirement accounts, while claiming poverty for child support. We had the engagement ring receipt, the apartment lease with both their names, the emails discussing their future children while he abandoned his actual child. The morning of his arrival, I dressed carefully in the kind of outfit he used to complement playing the role of eager wife one last time. Ethan wore his best shirt, the one he saved for special occasions, clutching a sign he'd made saying, "Welcome home, Daddy," with glitter and markers. We stood at arrivals like a Hallmark movie family, all while I knew the truth about why he was really returning. Marcus emerged from customs looking like a man who'd aged years in months. The Barcelona glow had faded to exhaustion, his expensive clothes wrinkled from the long flight and longer fall from grace. His smile when he saw us was genuine relief, not at reuniting with family, but at having a safe harbour after his ship had wrecked on the rocks of his own stupidity. The embrace he gave Ethan was real, I'll give him that. For a moment, he seemed to understand what he'd risked and lost. But then he hugged me, and I smelled the duty-free cologne he'd bought to mask whatever scent Sofia had left on him. He whispered that he'd missed me, and I whispered back that I knew, though he didn't understand the full meaning of those two words yet. The drive home was filled with his stories about Barcelona, carefully edited to remove Sofia's presence, but leaving obvious gaps that even Ethan noticed. Why did Daddy never mention co-workers? Why were there no photos of his office? How come he never showed us his apartment on video calls? I deflected Ethan's questions, while Marcus fumbled with explanations that would have been laughable if they weren't so pathetic. At home, he walked through the house like a visitor, noting changes that weren't there because nothing had changed except him. He commented on how well I'd managed alone, not knowing I'd thrived in his absence, getting promoted at work, strengthening friendships. He'd discouraged discovering I was happier without his constant criticism disguised as concern. The gifts he'd brought were telling in their cheapness. A knockoff FC Barcelona jersey for Ethan that fell apart in the first wash. A bottle of wine for me that cost less than the coffee he bought Sofia every morning. Generic chocolates from the duty-free shop probably purchased during his layover when he remembered he should bring something. The compass he'd given Ethan before leaving sat on the nightstand, pointing to a true north that no longer included Marcus. The charade lasted exactly 2 weeks. 14 days of me playing the devoted wife while documenting every lie Marcus told about his time in Barcelona. He'd refined his story during the flight home, creating an elaborate fiction about long hours establishing the European office, dealing with difficult Spanish contractors, navigating cultural differences that made the work harder than expected. He showed Ethan photos from Barcelona carefully curated to exclude Sofia, but including all the tourist spots he'd visited with her. I cooked his favourite meals while he complained about Spanish food being too heavy, never mentioning the Michelin-starred restaurants I knew he'd frequented. I washed his clothes, finding receipts in pockets he'd forgotten to check tickets from the Sagrada Familia, dated during a time he'd claimed to be in budget meetings. I smiled when he said he was glad to be home, even as he spent evenings texting frantically, probably trying to reach Sofia, who'd blocked him on everything except his most desperate channel email. He attempted to reclaim his position as head of household questioning expenses I'd managed perfectly in his absence. The electricity bill seemed high, Had I been careless with the thermostat? Why were there charges from restaurants when I should be cooking at home? What was this therapy bill for? Ethan, was that really necessary? Each question revealed his need for control, the same impulse that had led him to Sofia when I'd become too independent for his comfort. Marcus tried to access our joint accounts, discovering I'd changed the passwords for security while he was abroad. He asked for the new information casually, like it was a minor inconvenience rather than a major concern. When I provided limited access, he found the balance significantly lower than when he'd left, not knowing I'd documented every cent spent on maintaining the life he'd abandoned while he played house in Barcelona. The bedroom became a battlefield of unspoken tension. He reached for me at night, and I let him gathering DNA evidence, as Jennifer had suggested, proof of renewed intimacy that would complicate his abandonment claims. But my body was just present, not participating, and he noticed. He asked if I was angry about Barcelona, and I said no. I understood career sacrifices. The relief on his face was almost comical, this man, who thought he'd gotten away with everything. He started criticizing my appearance, subtle comments about weight gain, suggestions about updating my wardrobe comparisons to the stylish European women he'd observed. Each comment was carefully recorded by the cameras I'd installed, evidence of emotional abuse to add to the physical abandonment. He didn't know that I'd actually lost weight during his absence, that the clothes he criticized were deliberately chosen to make him comfortable in his superiority. Work became his excuse for avoiding family responsibilities, claiming he needed to rebuild relationships damaged by his absence. He stayed late at the office that had almost fired him, attended networking events that were really job interviews, rebuilt a professional reputation that Sofia had helped destroy. His company had put him on probation, a detail he didn't share, but that Maria had whispered during our coffee date. Marcus began rewriting history, telling Ethan stories about Barcelona that painted him as a lonely hero, sacrificing for family. He claimed he'd counted days until returning, that every sunset reminded him of home, that Spanish beaches couldn't compare to Puget Sound. Ethan absorbed these lies eagerly, so desperate for his father's attention that truth became irrelevant. I bit my tongue until it bled, knowing documentation was more valuable than confrontation. The second weekend, he suggested we needed date night to reconnect. I agreed, arranging babysitting while privately coordinating with Jennifer about timing. He took me to our old anniversary restaurant, not knowing I knew he'd planned to take Sofia there before leaving. He ordered the same wine we'd shared on our wedding night, told me I looked beautiful in candlelight, promised things would be better now that he was home. I played along, laughing at his stories, touching his hand across the table, letting him believe he was reclaiming his old life. Inside, I was calculating divorce settlement math, custody arrangements, how much alimony his depleted savings could manage. He talked about future vacations we'd never take home, improvements we'd never make growing old together, when he'd already chosen someone else to grow old with, until she'd chosen someone richer. He wanted to make love when we got home, calling it that, like we were newlyweds instead of strangers. I participated enough to avoid suspicion, thinking about the freedom waiting on the other side of legal papers. He fell asleep satisfied, not knowing this was the last time he'd touch me, the final performance in a marriage that had ended the moment he'd booked that flight with Sofia. Sunday morning, I made elaborate breakfast pancakes shaped like hearts that made Ethan giggle and Marcus uncomfortable. We went to the park, played family football, took photos that would later become evidence of his capacity for performance. He pushed Ethan on the swings while texting, probably searching for jobs in cities where his reputation hadn't been destroyed by his Barcelona adventure. That evening, I suggested a special dinner to celebrate our reunion properly. Marcus agreed eagerly, probably thinking I'd finally accepted his return, that life would resume its pre-Sofia rhythm. I sent Ethan to my mother's for a sleepover, telling him Daddy and I needed grown-up time. The innocence in his smile when he hugged Marcus goodbye almost broke my resolve, But I remembered the months of tears, the abandoned birthdays, the father who'd chosen a stranger over his son. I cooked steak, his favourite cut, prepared exactly how he liked it, bloody in the middle, like his conscience should have been. I opened a bottle of Chateau Margaux we'd been saving for our 15th anniversary, an occasion we'd never reach. I wore the dress he'd bought me for my 13th birthday, the last gift he'd given me before Sofia had appeared. I set the table with our wedding china-lit candles, created ambiance for destruction. Marcus was impressed, complimenting the effort, probably thinking about how much better a wife I'd become during his absence. He talked about work, careful to avoid Barcelona references, while I nodded and smiled and refilled his wine glass. He grew relaxed, expansive, started sharing dreams about the future that would never materialize. He even mentioned maybe trying for another child, a sibling for Ethan, as if he hadn't been planning babies with Sofia 3 months ago. After dinner, we moved to the living room with cognac, the expensive bottle he'd brought back from duty-free. He sat in his favourite chair, looking satisfied, a king returned to his throne. That's when I stood up, walked to the mantel, and picked up the blue folder I'd placed there that morning. His expression shifted from contentment to confusion as I handed it to him, saying I had something for him to see. The transformation of Marcus's face as he opened that blue folder was worth every sleepless night I'd spent preparing its contents. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion, then to shock, and finally to a rage that revealed the real man underneath the suburban father costume. 200 pages of evidence meticulously organized and tabulated, telling the complete story of his Barcelona betrayal in receipts, screenshots, and high-resolution photographs. The first section contained the divorce petition already filed with the court, citing abandonment, adultery, and financial malfeasance. The legal language was precise and damning, each, whereas and wherefore, building a case that Jennifer had called bulletproof. Washington states, no fault. Divorce laws didn't require proof of adultery, but it certainly helped with asset division and custody arrangements when one parent had demonstrably abandoned their child for a mistress. Next came the financial documentation, bank statements, highlighted with every transfer to Spain, every purchase for Sofia, every dollar stolen from our family's future. The credit card statements told their own story, a trail of expensive dinners, jewelry stores, and hotel rooms that coincided perfectly with his supposed work meetings. The total amount spent on his affair was itemized at the bottom of each page, growing larger until it reached the final sum of $123,417. The photography section was where his face truly crumbled. Professional quality surveillance photos from my investigator, showing Marcus and Sofia at beach clubs, restaurants, their apartment building. The engagement ring. Photos her hand displaying the diamond he'd bought with our retirement savings while telling me he couldn't afford increased child support. The real estate listings they'd viewed together, planning a future that erased his past, meaning us. His hands shook as he flipped through screenshots of their messages, conversations I'd pulled from his synced devices where he'd called her his soulmate, discussed having beautiful Spanish babies, and described me as the mistake he'd made in his 20s. The emails to the Barcelona office requesting permanent relocation, citing a desire to fully integrate into European culture with his partner, who would provide invaluable local insight. Marcus looked up at me, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine before landing on indignation. "How dare you spy on me?" he spat, as if surveillance was worse than abandonment. "This is illegal. You hacked my accounts. You violated my privacy." The man who'd spent 6 months lying was suddenly concerned about honesty and boundaries. I sat calmly on the sofa, sipping my cognac while he raged. "Everything was obtained legally," I said quietly. "Your devices were on our family account. Your email was accessed with passwords you gave me years ago. The photos were taken in public places. Jennifer made sure everything would be admissible in court, where it would all become public record, unless he agreed to my terms. He tried denial next, claiming the photos were misinterpreted, that Sofia was just a colleague, that the Barcelona assignment was legitimate. I pulled out my phone and played a video the investigator had taken of them kissing passionately outside their apartment, his hands tangled in her hair, her body pressed against his, in a way that suggested significant intimacy. The timestamp showed 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, when he'd claimed to be in budget meetings. When denial failed, he shifted to blame. "You drove me to this," he said, the classic cheater's defense. "You were always too focused on work, too tired for intimacy, too independent. You emasculated me with your success, made me feel unnecessary." Sofia appreciated him, understood his needs, made him feel like a man. I let him rant, each word being recorded by the hidden cameras, more evidence of his narcissism for the custody evaluation. Then came the threats, his last desperate attempt at control. He'd fight the divorce claim I was an unfit mother, tell everyone I was crazy. He'd take Ethan away, move back to Barcelona, disappear where American courts couldn't reach. He'd ruin my reputation at work, tell everyone I was vindictive and unstable. The threats were empty, and we both knew it, but he needed to feel powerful for a few more minutes. I waited until he exhausted himself, then pulled out the second folder, the one with screenshots from Sofia's Instagram, showing her with her new boyfriend, the property developer who'd replaced Marcus like he was a rental car. The messages, where she'd called him boring, complained about his performance in bed, laughed with her friends, about the American who thought he was living in a movie. The final email where she'd told him not to contact her again, that their time was fun but ultimately meaningless. His collapse was complete then, the fury dissolving into something pathetic. He actually started crying not for our destroyed marriage or abandoned son, but for his bruised ego. Sofia had played him the same way he'd played me, except she'd gotten paid for her performance, while I'd paid for mine. He blubbered about being confused, making mistakes midlife crisis. All the cliches men use when consequences finally arrive. That's when I revealed the recording device on the coffee table, the one that had captured his entire confession and threats. Jennifer would have copies by morning along with the security footage from our home cameras showing him reviewing the evidence of his guilt. Any attempt to fight the divorce would result in this becoming public, including to his employer, who had strict morality clauses about conduct unbecoming of leadership. I gave him 48 hours to sign the divorce agreement and leave our house. The terms were generous, considering the evidence he'd get supervised visitation with Ethan every other weekend, pay 30% of his income in child support and alimony, and receive 25% of our assets, after accounting for the money he'd stolen for Sofia. If he fought it, I'd push for full custody maximum support and publication of every embarrassing detail. Marcus aged 10 years in 10 minutes, his Barcelona tan fading to grey defeat. He asked where he was supposed to go, as if that was my problem to solve. His mother still had his childhood room, I suggested, though she'd probably have opinions about his behaviour once she learned the truth. His brother in Portland might take him in, though their relationship had been strained since Marcus had borrowed money for what he'd claimed was house repairs, but was actually Sofia's shopping sprees. He tried one more manipulation, dropping to his knees, in a performance that would have been moving if I hadn't watched him practice apologies in the bathroom mirror that morning, preparing for a confrontation he'd sensed coming. He begged for another chance, promised counselling, swore Sofia meant nothing, that we were his real life. He even invoked Ethan, saying our son needed his father, apparently forgetting the 6 months of absence. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. The December air was cold and sharp, like clarity after months of fog. "Get out," I said simply. "Take your suitcase and leave. Come back Thursday at noon for the rest of your things, if you're not gone in 48 hours. This all becomes public, including to your new girlfriend, who probably doesn't know about the STD test you failed last month, another document in the folder you apparently missed. His final exit was anticlimactic. No dramatic door slam or passionate declarations, just a broken man wheeling a suitcase to his car while neighbours pretended not to watch through curtains. He sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, probably calling friends to find a couch to crash on, discovering how few people wanted to shelter a man who'd abandoned his family for a failed European fantasy. I watched from the window until his taillights disappeared, then walked through my house that suddenly felt larger, airier, like windows had been opened after years of suffocation. Ethan would be devastated initially, but children are resilient with proper support. I'd already lined up therapy activities, a support system that didn't include a father who treated family like accessories to discard when newer models appeared. The divorce proceedings moved with surprising speed once Marcus realized the extent of my preparation and the futility of resistance. He signed the papers in Jennifer's office, without fanfare, his signature shaky but legal. The man who'd spent 6 months living a fantasy in Barcelona was finally forced to confront reality in a sterile conference room overlooking Pike Street, where Seattle's December rain seemed to mock his Mediterranean dreams. His downfall was swift and thorough. Word travelled through Seattle's tech community with the efficiency of fibre optic cables. The executive who'd abandoned his family for a Spanish fling became cautionary tale whispered at networking events and LinkedIn posts about work-life balance. His company conducted an investigation into his relationship with Sofia, a subordinate, and found enough policy violations to justify immediate termination with cause, meaning no severance package to cushion his landing. Sofia, safely back in Barcelona, with her wealthy developer, blocked Marcus on every platform when he tried to reach out for closure or sympathy. Her final Instagram post before going private showed her on a yacht near Ibiza diamond earrings, catching the sun, captioned, "Living my best life," with no mention of the American who'd financed her transition from startup designer to kept woman. She'd used him as effectively as he'd used me, except she'd walked away richer while he'd lost everything. Marcus moved in with his mother in Tacoma, a humiliation that struck deeper than any divorce settlement. At 68, she'd expected grandchildren visits, not her divorced son sleeping in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by participation trophies and yearbook photos from when he still had potential. She called me once, apologizing for raising a son who could abandon his family, her disappointment more devastating than any court judgment. The custody arrangement settled into a rhythm that prioritized Ethan's stability over Marcus's ego. Every other weekend, supervised visitation at a court-approved facility where professionals ensured he couldn't disappear again with promises of Barcelona beaches. Ethan initially cried for his father, but children adapt faster than adults think, and the consistency of my presence versus Marcus's absence spoke louder than any explanation I could provide. My promotion to regional manager came through 2 weeks after the divorce, finalized a coincidence that felt like karma's compensation. The salary increase more than covered the household expenses, and the flexible schedule meant I could attend every soccer game, school play, and parent-teacher conference without apologizing to anyone. Success really was the best revenge, especially when Marcus was working as a contract consultant for a quarter of his previous salary. The house felt different without his presence, lighter somehow, like removing heavy curtains and letting sunshine flood previously dark corners. I redecorated systematically, starting with the bedroom, where I burned sage and bought new sheets that had never known his weight. The office became an art studio where Ethan and I painted on weekends, replacing PowerPoints with watercolours, spreadsheets with creativity. 6 months after the divorce, I opened my own restaurant, something I'd dreamed about since culinary school, but Marcus had deemed too risky. The business loan came through easily, with my new salary and clean credit history unmarred by secret Barcelona expenses. The space was small but perfect, 40 seats in a converted craftsman house where I could finally cook without criticism, create without compromise. Opening night brought unexpected support from the community that had watched our drama unfold. Tables filled with neighbours, co-workers, other single mothers who understood the journey from betrayal to triumph. Even Marcus's former colleagues came their presence, a subtle acknowledgement of shifted allegiances. The reviews were glowing, focusing on the authenticity of flavours, the warmth of atmosphere, the passion evident in every dish. Ethan thrived in the new normal, his grades improving once the uncertainty of his father's presence lifted. He joined the robotics club, made new friends, discovered interests beyond waiting for Daddy to call from Barcelona. The therapist said he was processing the abandonment remarkably well, understanding at 8 what some adults never grasp, that love isn't measured by promises, but by presence. Marcus's visits with Ethan became sporadic as his financial situation deteriorated. The supervised facility was expensive and his contract work didn't always cover child support, plus visitation costs. He'd cancelled 3 times in 2 months, each excuse more transparent than the last. Ethan stopped asking when he'd see Daddy next, the question fading like his memories of the father who'd chosen elsewhere over here. I met Daniel at a restaurant industry event, both of us sampling wine from a new distributor, while discussing the impossibility of finding reliable sous chefs. He was 42, divorced 5 years earlier when his wife decided motherhood wasn't for her, leaving him with full custody of his daughter Emma. We bonded over single-parent struggles, shared custody apps that never worked properly, the exhaustion of being everything to someone who deserved everything. Our first date was coffee while our kids were at school, breaking the single-parent rule of never wasting child-free time on anything frivolous. But conversation flowed like the coffee both of us starved for adult interaction that didn't involve lawyers or teachers. He didn't flinch when I told him about Barcelona, about the investigation, about the vindication of preparation. He shared his own story of abandonment, though his ex had at least been honest about leaving rather than constructing elaborate lies. Daniel understood boundaries, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. He brought Emma to the restaurant where she and Ethan bonded over mocktails I created specially for them, feeling like sophisticated diners with their fancy drinks and separate checks. We took them to museums, parks, beaches, creating new memories that didn't require editing out painful history. Marcus found out about Daniel through Ethan's innocent mention during a rare visitation. The rage in his voice when he called that night was familiar but toothless, a lion roaring from a cage he'd locked himself in. How dare I expose our son to another man, confuse him with complicated relationships, risk his emotional stability. The hypocrisy was stunning from a man who'd abandoned his family for a woman he'd known 3 months. I didn't engage, simply forwarding his threatening voicemail to Jennifer, who added it to our file, documenting continued harassment. The restraining order came through quickly, requiring Marcus to communicate only through a court-approved app about Ethan-related matters. His world shrank smaller, while mine expanded the inverse of what he'd probably imagined when boarding that plane to Barcelona. The 1-year anniversary of his return passed without mention, though I knew he remembered because he tried sending flowers to the restaurant. I donated them to the nearby hospital, telling the volunteer they were from a satisfied customer, which was true in its own way. His absence had satisfied me more than his presence ever had, teaching me that subtraction could be addition if you removed the right elements. Ethan asked about Barcelona, once wondering if we could visit the places Daddy had worked. I told him maybe someday when he was older, though we both knew that particular destination had been permanently deleted from our travel goals. Instead, we planned a trip to Hawaii somewhere, without complicated history or abandoned promises, just ocean and volcano and the possibility of beginning again. Marcus's last attempt at reconciliation came through his mother, who called suggesting family therapy might heal our wounds. I politely declined, explaining that some wounds needed to remain open as reminders of what not to accept again. She understood, having lived with her own regrets about staying too long with Marcus's father, who'd had his own Sofias over the years, though he'd been discreet enough to keep them local. The restaurant flourished beyond my careful projections, requiring expansion into the space next door within 8 months. I hired, carefully building a team that understood second chances, fresh starts, the dignity of moving forward without looking back. Several employees were single parents, divorced, rebuilding our kitchen, becoming a sanctuary for those who understood that sometimes the best recipes came from improvisation after the original plan burned. Ethan and I developed our own traditions: Saturday morning farmers market followed by experimental cooking, Sunday hikes where we identified plants and insects, building connection with the natural world that didn't require explanation or justification. He stopped asking about Daddy, the word fading from his vocabulary, like Barcelona had faded from our future, replaced by the solid presence of what actually existed, rather than what had been promised. Have you ever discovered your partner was living a double life? How did you handle the betrayal? Did you confront immediately, or did you plan your response carefully, like I did? I want to hear your stories about starting over, about finding strength in situations that initially felt like weakness. Please share in the comments below. Your experiences might help someone currently facing their own Barcelona moment. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to hear more about resilience, redemption, and the power of patient planning. Share this with anyone who needs to know that betrayal isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of a better chapter written entirely by you. Thank you for listening to my journey from abandonment to achievement. May you find the strength to recognize when someone's absence is actually a gift, the wisdom to plan your response rather than react from emotion, and the courage to build something beautiful from the ruins of what someone else destroyed. Remember, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. And sometimes that requires letting them think they've won while you quietly build your victory.